What a character. Robert Durst. If you've seen him in The Jinx, he's a little eccentric looking. He was the oldest of three kids to an uber wealthy real estate developer in New York, Seymour Durst. So he grew up a very privileged lifestyle in one of the wealthiest suburbs of New York City, Scarsdale. Scarsdale is home to celebrities like Yoko Ono, Liza Minnelli. Their beautiful Tudor homes and business fronts built in the 1920s. And this is top ranked public school district. Gives you an idea of where he grew up. Now, to be fair, this very odd looking man did suffer a tremendous loss that affected him profoundly. When he was 7 years old, his mother disappeared. What we know now is we're not sure which, but she either fell or leapt to her death from the roof of their family home on Hampton Road. Fast forward, he went to college. He went to Lehigh University. This is a private research university in Pennsylvania. It's self described as a community of future makers. You can see his destiny. But Robert Durst dropped out of college. So, despite being heir to the massive Durst organization, this was a commercial real estate empire worth millions. Robert had no interest in joining his father's company. Instead, he met and had two dates with a dental hygienist, Kathleen McCormick. This was back in 1971. And after those two dates, they decided to move together to Vermont to open a health food store, his own business. This is good. All good things. His father, though, it didn't take long to convince Durst to come back to New York so he could run the family business. So within 2 years, in 1973, Robert Durst agreed and took his wife with him. Well, at this time, they were just girlfriend, boyfriend, but took her with him to return to New York. And in fact, once they returned to New York when Robert Durst was 30, Durst and Kathy got married. Now, let's fast forward again a little bit in his life. And by 1992, his father was said to have had enough of Durst's inappropriate behavior. Now, translation, things like cross dressing. Durst enjoyed some of these things. Father did not. So it's controverted if Durst quit or his father got rid of him. But however it happened, his younger brother Douglas, Robert's younger brother Douglas, was appointed as the successor of the Durst organization. Now, despite the fact that it was well known that Robert didn't have any interest in that family business, he still believed that it was his right, that he was entitled to the business, and he, in fact, accused his own brother of stealing his share of the business. Now, this caused a huge rift in the family, and Durst, not surprising, we know litigation happens a lot. He filed a lawsuit, rather, to claim his portion of the family fortune. In 2006, he got $65 million from the company. It was said he was worth $100 million. But this prideful, eccentric millionaire would soon turn to murder. The sin? Pride. Pride is defined as an excessive love of oneself. Characteristics include self-centeredness, superiority, arrogance. It is defined as the original sin because it contradicts human behavior. This is the why behind the crime, the motive. I'm Ashley Willcott. I've been a TV anchor, a judge, and a trial lawyer. And I would say that almost all of the cases I've covered over the years intersect with one of the 7 deadly sins: pride, greed, wrath, envy, lust, gluttony, sloth. The opposite of the 7 heavenly virtues. Temptations that, taken too far, turn deadly. This week, we break down the case of Robert Durst and how the deadly sin of pride cost the world's goodness more than once. A little later, I'm joined by Philip Dubé in our breakdown segment, where we go deep on the how and the why of one of the biggest cases of the 20th century that still lives on today. Let's get into it. This is the Deadly Seven. Durst is not named in one, not two, but 3 murders of his wife, his best friend, and his neighbor. At 78 years old, Robert Durst pled not guilty to murdering his best friend, Susan Berman, who was shot in the back of her head in her own home in Los Angeles in December of 2000. Prosecutors say the reason he silenced Berman was because she was going to tell police that she helped him cover up the killing of his wife, Kathy, in New York in 1982. Now, he'd long been suspected of killing his wife. That's what most people thought, whose body has never been found, by the way. The body of his wife, Kathy, still not found. And he's always denied any role in her disappearance. Let's talk about this Robert Durst, an eccentric, again, worth more than $100 million. After he was accused of shooting execution style his best friend, he was held without bail. Not surprising, because certainly with his wealth, he could find a way to escape. Held without bail. And he was only charged with Berman's killing. But the prosecutors used his wife's disappearance and the death killing of the neighbor in Texas to build a case against Robert Durst. His best friend Berman was a Las Vegas mobster's daughter who met Durst at the University of California in Los Angeles, and she served as his unofficial spokesperson when his wife, Kathy Durst, vanished. She helped him cover his tracks, according to the prosecution. And after New York investigators announced in the fall of 2000 that they were reopening the case, looking into the disappearance of Kathy, Durst's wife, Berman told Durst that she was going to speak with the police about what she knew. 2 months later, she was dead. 9 months after that, Durst fatally shot his neighbor Morris Black in a Galveston, Texas boarding house, where, get this, Robert Durst had gone into hiding at that boarding house as a mute woman. Prosecutors say the reason he killed Black, his neighbor, was because the neighbor discovered his real identity. Now, get this, Durst was acquitted because he testified that Black pulled a pistol on him and that his neighbor Black was shot as they struggled for the weapon. Here's the rest of his testimony, though. He said after he got shot in that struggle, he panicked, so he butchered the man's body. That's right. One little detail about this case, he dismembered the body of his neighbor Black in Galveston, Texas, and then tossed it into the Galveston Bay. He described during his trial for the murder of his neighbor, he described cutting up the body in great detail and almost with glee, that it was like cutting up a chicken and sawing in between the bone and the cartilage to cut the chicken pieces. So, fast forward to the trial in Los Angeles against now his best friend, remember, who was executed by the shot in the back of the head. His defense attorney said he didn't kill Berman and he didn't know who did. But he did say that Durst found her body, panicked, and bolted. In fact, Robert Durst sent police a cryptic note alerting them to a cadaver in the house. And the only reason that he said he did that was to ensure she would be found. Durst long denied that he had written that note that said cadaver. Robert Durst was arrested in New Orleans in 2015. And this was the eve of the final episode of The Jinx on HBO. You might have seen it, The Life and Death of Robert Durst. And this was a documentary in which he was confronted with that cadaver note and a letter that he had once sent his best friend Berman. And that letter had similar block print writing, and the city of Beverly Hills was misspelled. Before being shown the letter that he had written to Berman, Durst told the filmmakers, this was in The Jinx, the HBO documentary, that only the killer could have written the cadaver note. Now, after that gotcha moment on camera, he was caught on a hot mic. He excuses himself to go to the restroom. He forgets to turn off his mic. And he says to himself in the bathroom, "You're caught. What the hell did I do? Killed them all, of course." This was some of the key evidence in the trial against him. I want to kind of recap the arrogance of this murder chronologically to help make sense of it all and some of the pieces of the puzzle. Again, the wife, Kathy, in 1978, they're married. She got a nursing degree, and then she enters the Albert Einstein College of Medicine in the Bronx. She's going to be a doctor. Shortly thereafter, in January of 1982, she's treated at the hospital in Bronx for facial injuries, and friends testified that she told them those injuries were done by her husband, Robert Durst. Later that month, on January 31st of 1982, Kathy Durst leaves a dinner party in Connecticut, and she goes back to their home in South Salem. By all accounts, they have an argument, but then according to Robert Durst, who did testify in his trial, he says he drove her to the train station and then later was able to reach her by telephone at their Riverside Drive apartment in Manhattan. The next day, February 1st of 1982, a woman claiming to be Kathy Durst calls the medical school and says, "I'm too sick to start a pediatric clerkship that was starting that morning. So I'm not going to be at this clerkship." Everybody who knew her knew she was committed and dedicated to being a doctor. So it kind of raised some flags. 4 days later, on February 5th, Robert Durst reports his wife missing to the police in Manhattan. And during that entire media firestorm that ensued, remember, he's worth $100 million. His father is a famous commercial real estate developer. So during that entire media firestorm, it was Susan Berman, his close friend, that served as his unofficial spokesperson. So moving forward, in 1983, the estate conflict begins in court because the sister of Kathy contends in an affidavit that Robert Durst is responsible for Kathy's disappearance. Remember, her body has never been found. A few years later, Robert Durst, unbeknownst to her family and any of Durst's friends, he gets a divorce from Kathy by saying spousal abandonment. So everybody thinks he's involved in the disappearance. Nobody can prove it. But 9 years later, the state police, they reopen the investigation into the disappearance of Kathy Durst. They search Truesdale Lake. They scour the Hoyt Street cottage for forensic evidence. That's the place where Robert and Kathy lived together as husband and wife. And in 2000, the police decided, we're going to take this public. We're going to see what the public knows. So the revived investigation becomes public. That very next month, Durst leaves. He goes to Galveston, Texas, where he rents the apartment again, posing as the mute woman named Dorothy. And that name was the name of a high school girlfriend he had not seen in decades. That's in November of 2000. 1 month later, he marries a real estate broker from Manhattan. And then 8 days after that, it starts to get a little convoluted. But he flies from Texas to California, and then he heads to Trinidad. After that, and there's significance of this in the evidence, he uses a calling card to make 2 calls from a payphone in California. December 23rd of 2000, Durst fatally shoots Susan Berman in her home in Los Angeles. He then goes back to New York. On December 24th of 2000, that's when Los Angeles police discover the body of Berman. After neighbors reported that her dogs are running loose in the neighborhood, they subsequently received the note that directs them to Berman's address with the word cadaver. Almost a year later, in September of 2001, that's when 71-year-old Morris Black, who is the neighbor of Robert Durst, is shot to death in Durst's apartment. It's in 2001 that Durst dismembers that body and dumps it in Galveston Bay, where it's discovered, and the evidence leads the police back to Robert Durst. Robert Durst begins to engage in more hijinks. He disappears and becomes a fugitive, but he then rents a car in Alabama, but he identifies himself as Morris Black, the one that he shot and killed. He's then accused of shoplifting a chicken sandwich, bandages, and newspaper at a Wegmans supermarket in Pennsylvania. Now, remember, at the time he's arrested and charged with that, he actually has more than $38,000 cash on him at the time, but yet he's arrested for shoplifting. He also had 2 loaded guns on him at that time. So they arrest him, they take him back to Texas, and he is tried for the murder of Morris Black. He's acquitted by a jury, an unlikely turn of events based on the evidence. But they seem to believe Robert Durst that it was an accidental shooting. The only thing he did was dismember the body because he panicked. As a result of this case for the death of Morris Black, of which he was acquitted, he then has some other legal issues. He's got gun charges, he's on parole. He finishes all that and moves on with his life. But he does not move on from the life of crime. In December of 2010, there was a movie called All Good Things. This was a feature film with Ryan Gosling and Kirsten Dunst, and that was based on Durst's life. That comes out, and then he gets arrested on a bizarre number of different kinds of charges. He shows up outside the Midtown homes of his brother and another relative, and so he is charged with trespassing because they actually had an order of protection out against him. He is charged with criminal mischief in Texas, in Houston, Texas, because he urinated on a candy rack at CVS. So he is doing all kinds of things. Now, it's important to note that this prideful man, he seemed to get out of his trouble. He was acquitted of the murder of his neighbor, and then he was also acquitted after a trial of trespassing on his relative's property. He gets out of these things. The urinating in the CVS on a candy rack, he got out of that by pleading no contest. So he's moving along in his life, and in February of 2015, HBO airs the first episode of The Jinx, The Life and Death of Robert Durst. Within 1 month, he's arrested in New Orleans, charging him with the first-degree murder of Susan Berman, his best friend, who was executed with a shot in the back of the head. That final episode of The Jinx, when that airs, it concludes with Durst confronted about his handwriting matching the cadaver note, that cadaver note that he'd already said for the film, whoever wrote the cadaver note had to have been the killer. And that's when he talks on his open mic. That's it, you're caught. What the hell did I do? Killed them all, of course. It took nearly 15 years for police to arrest Robert Durst in the killing of his best friend. It took another 5 to bring him to trial. That trial started on March 4th of 2020, California versus Robert Durst. After just 2 days of testimony, jurors were sent home because of the coronavirus. All the courthouses closed. 14 months later, trial resumed with the same jury. It's unprecedented. So they had opening statements again, and they started over. Now, the trial itself lasted for months. Robert Durst testified for 14 days. His arrogance, he wouldn't stop talking. That included 9 days of cross-examination. After 2 days of deliberations, the jury finds Robert Durst guilty of first-degree murder of Susan Berman, including a special circumstance that he killed her as a witness because of what she might reveal about what happened to his wife, Kathy, the remains of whom have never been found. On October 14th of 2021, the Los Angeles County judge sentences Robert Durst to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Shortly after that sentencing, his attorney announced that Durst had COVID. He died a few days later at the age of 78. Here's what I think. Robert Durst, what an arrogant, weird creep. He was an eccentric, yes, but he had millions. He could have done good things. He could have helped others. He could have lived a life of service. He could have chosen to travel to exotic places. He was worth $100 million. He could have done anything that he wanted to do. Literally, he could have, employed people to discover himself. Instead, he's so self-centered that he starts by suing his own family for more money from the estate because he doesn't like that he was kind of kicked out of the business or chose to leave the business and lost that portion of his inheritance. He won that back from his lawsuit. He then allegedly kills his wife. She disappeared. She's still never been found since 1982. He executes his best friend because of what she knows about what happened to his wife by shooting her in the back of the head. He shoots and dismembers his neighbor in Galveston, Texas, where he was so self-centered that he had gone there to live and hide his identity, dressing up as a mute woman. Robert Durst, his pride, the original sin, did him in and led to a life of murder. Now, he's only been convicted of one of those murders, Susan Berman's, but there sure is a lot of other circumstantial evidence that he was involved in the other two as well. We know that he did shoot and kill Morris Black, but he was acquitted of a jury, but not of dismembering that body. What a sick, eccentric. Let me bring in now one of my favorite guests, Philip Dubé. We've known each other a long time. I love what you have to add. You're a deputy public defender in Los Angeles County. You've been doing that for some time. Thank you for joining. You're in LA. To me, this man is a Hollywood drama.
Oh, yeah. Are you kidding? He's like an icon now. He's done the Jinx movies. Probably, I don't know exactly how much money he made on that. And frankly, I don't even think it was about the money. I think he just loved the limelight. He loved being heard, you know? But I will say, to be fair to him, and he even testified to this at the murder trial, he is living on the spectrum or was living. He had what we call autism spectrum disorder level 1. In the old days, we called it Asperger's syndrome, you know? And basically what it means is that he has a sort of a communication and a skill set deficiency. He doesn't know how to interact properly with people, and it's part of that disorder. It's a pervasive sort of disability. And there's really no known cure for it other than to treat it through behavioral therapy. So he came off as a bit of an oddity to people, just no social skills in a social setting. And it's sad because I think a lot of people cozied up to him because of his wealth, not because they were truly into him. And I think Susan Berman met her demise because he finally felt threatened by her and took advantage and preyed upon his disabilities by trying to blackmail him, if you will, out of money to prevent her from going to the cops about the death of Kathy Durst. And unfortunately, it cost her her
Well,
life
let's
and him.
It did, and I didn't mean to interrupt you, but you've said so many great things that I really wanna break down. One of the things that I get frustrated by is when we do hear that individuals who have been charged with or convicted of crimes have some type of diagnosis or a condition, and you're right as to his
Yeah.
diagnosis and the Asperger's, and I un say that again?
No, no, I'm just nodding yes. Yeah.
I
Mhm.
but and I understand that,
Yeah, of
but how many individuals out there in the world have that and don't kill people,
course.
aren't so arrogant that they're mad that they're being blackmailed and being blackmailed, by the way, for covering up allegedly the death of his wife that he was involved in allegedly, right? But the arrogance to say, "Oh, I can't believe she's doing this. I know. I'm gonna execute her."
Well, it's interesting. He is not what I would call your classic serial killer. He's not homicidal by nature, even though he's got 3 murders under his belt. If you notice, he wasn't opportunistic or predatory. He only killed when cornered, you know? So, and I truly believe, just based on the evidence that I've seen, that the quote unquote death of Kathy Durst, which we don't know, to be honest with you, was even a homicide, was not an intentional murder. I truly believe, based on everything that I've read about him and her, that it may have been a manslaughter, some type of heat of passion, and everything flowing from that was designed to cover up that death. And if he felt cornered, that people were kind of homing in on him and were going to expose it, that's when he acted. But it's not as if he just went out in the world trying to prey on people and end lives. So it was really a matter of self preservation, almost like an animal in the wild.
That is an interesting point as you look at it because, the reality is friends, you remember this, testified that, his wife, Kathy, had bruises on her face, she had to go to the hospital, that she had told them it was at his hands. So, starting with some domestic violence according to their testimony. And this trial, it went on for months. But, Philip, let's talk about one of the legalities of the trial because COVID hit, and once that hit, they had just started, they'd had 2 days of trial when COVID hit, courthouses closed. They come back 14 months later with the same jury, and, defense, I think, appropriately argued, "This is unprecedented, but you've gotta be kidding, this jury, who knows in those 14 months how many of them went out and watched The Jinx, watched the movie about his life with Ryan Gosling, read the newspapers, and are now going to have these ideas to make them not fair and impartial." And the judge said, "No, we're going forward." Talk about this unprecedented 14 months later picking up with trial again.
Yeah, it particularly in California, you have the right to be tried. In other words, to actually announce ready and be sent to a trial courtroom and have a panel of jurors sworn in within 60 days from the date of your arraignment, unless, of course, there is good cause and you waive time for that purpose. But ultimately, they got sent to the trial court on time without a violation of any right to a speedy trial. And once the 12 in the box were sworn and they started the actual testimony, the speedy trial right is no longer implicated. It has been preserved and protected. So the question is, if there's an adjournment mid-trial, and in this case, I think it was 2, 3 days after the testimony started, um, what do you have to show to earn a mistrial or a dismissal? And the bottom line is, you have to show prejudice. And there was no prejudice to Robert Durst. And as a matter of fact, his counsel petitioned the Court of Appeals for interlocutory relief, meaning writ relief or sort of an immediate appeal, and they lost on all fronts. They could not show prejudice by putting it over 14 months. And you got to understand something. We were in the throes of a pandemic at the time, and we were under very strict orders from our state Supreme Court to have social distancing, to do whatever we could to minimize the surge and the infection rate. So the courts were closely monitoring the director's mandates from our Department of Health to look at the infection rates in LA County. And that's how they kind of decided how to cluster and schedule court cases. And during that particular time, they had to almost eliminate all in person court appearances and maybe appear via Zoom or WebEx or otherwise remotely and minimize face to face contact, including jurors. So they had to put it over until that surge really had calmed down. And it took us almost 14 months, you know? I happen to be an essential worker because I am a deputy public defender, and we were obligated to be in court every day. And we did whatever we could to keep people out of court. And we were truly down to a skeleton crew in the courts. And in the end, it was all in the name of public health and public interest. And of course, to protect the court staff, the jurors, and the clients, the defendants who are actually being prosecuted. So, absent prejudice from that lengthy adjournment, the show must go on. And there's
The show must go
show
on.
yeah,
And when it was on and when it was on TV, you could see all the safeguards that were taken, right? The
yeah.
plexiglass that people were behind, and they had the notebooks and the pens and pencils for the jurors in bags that they gave them so everything could be sanitized. Philip, was a whole new way of doing business in court, and it was fascinating to watch because it's one of the first televised trials that really showed us what it was like to try a case in COVID.
And, at the turn of the 20th century, when we had the quote unquote Spanish flu, uh, we had the same problem. Obviously, we didn't have the same population, but they still had to do trials. And you know what they did? They used a field at a local high school in the city of Santa Monica and literally did trials outdoors. And in those days, they didn't have a court reporter as we know them now. They would have a court reporter sitting in the middle of the well, this sort of artificial well with a Greg shorthand pad, and they were literally taking everything down verbatim through Greg shorthand, but we were all outdoors at the time. And that's how they were taking the testimony. And it was all designed to protect everybody from infection. The death rate was staggering back then. But they nonetheless still did trials, but they opted not to do trials outdoors here and follow that model from the turn of the 20th century. Instead, they just said, let's adjourn and we'll deal with it on a very fluid basis to monitor the infection rate. And that's what they did. And unfortunately, Durst's trial happened to be up where he got that 14-month delay.
Yes, yes. All right, so let's talk about the other part of the Durst trial. Here you have a man in his 70s who had health conditions, so he wasn't healthy, and I remember watching he was in a wheelchair, and I think they probably purposefully, Philip, the defense, let him lean into how he was feeling. He looked like a sad, pitiful, decrepit old man in his wheelchair, pitifully being tried for murder. How much does this affect? I mean, the jury, I think, did the right thing and convicted him. But during the trial, you're watching this unfold and you're like, this guy? You're saying this guy shot her in the back of the head execution style?
Yeah, unfortunately, the crime had occurred so many years prior to the trial. He was a younger, much more robust, healthy guy. And unfortunately, by the time he made it to trial, he was way past his prime. He was quite fragile, almost like a feeble old guy, but he was still sharp as a tack, you
Yeah,
know?
mentally.
Mentally, and the test, not just in state court, but constitutionally, is not how frail you are and how fragile you are, it's whether or not you're mentally incompetent. And because he was sharp, he had all his faculties, the court was merely obligated to accommodate all the health concerns. If it meant that he got fatigued, then you would adjourn for the day. If it meant he was in pain, you give him a painkiller, and if he nods off, you adjourn for the day. But you don't halt the proceedings. You only do that if he's deemed to not understand the nature of the proceedings and he can't cooperate with his counsel. But he was absolutely able to do all that. And absent some showing of a mental deficiency, the show must go on, you know?
The show must go on. But what an arrogant man, because when you do watch the Jinx, when you do read, when you were listening to him testify for numerous days, 9 days alone on cross-examination, to me, he was so self-centered. He was had such an air of superiority that I did find him very prideful, and I think that really is an underlying theme in all of the actions and crimes that he's been involved with.
I'm not even sure it's an issue of pride, to be honest with you. I think it's an issue of privilege and entitlement. You know, he grew up a multimillionaire, you know, and by the way, he wasn't self made. You know, everything kind of fell into his lap because of the wealth of the family. So it's not as if he went down, and got dirty and got his hands dirty and did all the work himself and put in all the work and the elbow grease. He just stood there with his hand out and said, "Give me my share." And that's how he lived his life. Now, it's not to say that beneficiaries don't have good intentions. Obviously, lovely, wonderful people can inherit that type of wealth. But people would kowtow to him because he was so generous with people, but they always expected something in return. And I think that's why Durst had a really hard time finding good friends. Certainly, there were people in his life, but nobody that he could truly trust. And if he felt that they were going to cross him and turn him in, they would meet their demise, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah, he would just get rid of
Get rid
him.
of
Let's
him.
get rid of him.
Yeah.
He loved himself so
Yeah.
much that if he was threatened, "All right, I love myself this much, I'm gonna get rid of them, and then I'm not threatened." And, do you think, Philip, so in the Jinx, we know he had an open mic when he went to the bathroom, and when he went to the bathroom and he said the words about, "I killed them all," of course. Do you think that without that evidence, do you think he would have been convicted?
Absolutely. They still had plenty of other stuff, even if you severed all that. He gave so many statements on camera, about what if I would have done it, and whoever did this had to have written that cadaver note. Remember all that? So he basically gave himself away in other ways, Not to mention the motive was there. It was obvious that Susan Berman told him that Westchester County, New York authorities reached out to her to get a statement regarding the disappearance of Kathy Durst, back then known as Kathy McCormick. He was petrified, absolutely terrified that she was going to sing like a bird and lay him out. So, but in answer to your question, yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So let me ask you, you're out there in LA. I just took my son out to LA and people think of LA movie stars, that you're going to see a movie star on every corner. I know that's not accurate, but I also know that you have a really good sense of what is it like, number one, to represent someone who's famous or touch on a case with someone who's famous. How do you, how does that affect all of
A lot
this?
of it goes back to that entitlement. As a deputy public defender, generally, we represent the indigent. But once in a while, we come across former celebrities who have lost all their wealth, who don't really have much. They've descended into alcoholism, drug addiction, and have lost everything. But they still have that sense of entitlement because of all the people in their ecosystem who kowtowed to them. And I tell them all the time, it doesn't work that way with me anyway. I have dealt with street people, with homeless, with the mentally ill. I'm not going to treat you any differently. You're going to get fair and adequate representation, but I'm not going to step it up merely because you had an Emmy, or merely because you were nominated. It doesn't work that way, okay? And by the way, that would not impress a jury, frankly. Here you are charged with drug trafficking, and you want to hold up your Emmy trophy like that's going to blow the case wide open and walk you right out of your jail cell. Think again, it ain't gonna happen. So, no, I treat them like any other client, and I've had a few. I represented, the young kid who played, Eddie Munster years ago. Unfortunately, he picked up a drug charge at the Compton courthouse, and I defended him. We successfully got it reduced to a misdemeanor, and I think in the end it was dismissed outright. I represented briefly, we got substituted out, a very famous Hollywood esthetician. Her name was Dawn DeLuise. She was charged with basically hiring a hitman to kill a skin specialist competitor, you know? Yeah, she did facials and skincare for the wealthy and the rich and famous. And unfortunately, she found herself arrested. And it turned out that it was a really warped, sick client that accused her of that. And it was just simply not true. And she was acquitted by a jury. I did not do the trial. We were substituted out by very competent private counsel, and he walked her right out the door.
Wow. See, and I envision Robert Durst being the way you're describing. Here's my Emmy. Even if I didn't get it for the Jinx, I should have. And look at me, because he did seem to love the
Yeah.
limelight. And so the second part of that question for you, Philip, is I know how well you defend your clients. I know how zealous you are about representing them. But this is a question we've talked about on court TV as well, which is, how do you do it? Here you have a man that has everything at his fingertips. Literally, how many people, would think that they think it's not true, but they think, "Boy, I'd be on easy street if I had $60 million for my family that I could go do whatever I wanted with. I'd have the best, easiest, happiest life in the world." Not necessarily true, but people think that. So here you have a man like that, and, he executes his best friend by shooting her in the back, alleged best friend, by shooting her in the back of the head. He's really a monster. He had every opportunity for everything good in his life, and yet this is what he chose to do, even if it's because he felt like he was cornered. How do you sleep at night representing a person like
Oh,
that?
well, first of all, I got over that years ago. You know, you reach a certain comfort level after you've done 100 jury trials, you know? I am not at all moved or influenced or swayed by the visceral aspects of criminal trials. I look at it more from a cerebral standpoint. You know, I look at the file and say, well, first of all, what do they got? I try to look at it through the lens of a prosecutor and not as a, oh, mercy me, pearl clutching heavens to Murgatroyd juror from the west side of LA who is used to living in their mansion, either in the Palisades or Beverly Hills. I look at it as if I'm a scrappy, gritty defense attorney. What do they have? What can they prove? What's missing? What's the defense? I don't care if he slit somebody's throat ear to ear, stole a car, used somebody's credit cards. The test is, what do they have? Can they prove this beyond a reasonable doubt? So the emotionality aspect of it is long gone, you know. It's not to say that I'm not sympathetic, because don't get me wrong, I still get cases all the time that I feel are just overcharged. I can't even begin to tell you how many I have right now. I'm like, why are you filing this? Why are you coming down so hard on this guy? You know? And I won't even bore you with a lot of them. But the bottom line is, their social life, their family life, their wealth, all of that is of no moment. And generally speaking, generally, the clients that we represent are indigent. And any wealth that they might have is not their own. It's coming from families who are helping them out, maybe paying for their therapy, paying for their wardrobe. But certainly, they don't have cash readily available to go out and just retain their own private attorney. If they do, we will not qualify them for our services because, again, we're there to defend the poor.
Yeah. So who cares about what people do? I don't judge. So it doesn't matter
Yeah.
that Durst was cross-dressing. It doesn't matter that he was pretending to be a mute woman. Who cares? Like, that's all personal choice. But if he's doing that to hide out and not get caught for the crimes, that's where it's an issue. So do you think those are indicators, the fact he was hiding and disguising himself, are those indicators, in your opinion, that he truly was involved in the disappearance of his wife, Kathy, or
Oh,
not?
yeah. And he was intensely paranoid about it. Once he found
Mm.
out or believed that Westchester County, New York had reopened the investigation into her disappearance, he freaked out, for lack of a better term. And Susan Berman kind of played on it. She calls him up and basically says, guess what? I got a call. I think they're after you again. They've decided to reopen this and they want to talk to me. And the truth is, they never did reach out to her. She was playing mind games with him, and truth be told, had she have kept her mouth shut, she'd probably still be alive. She wouldn't be a young woman, she'd be what? Probably in her 80s by now, but nonetheless, she would still be alive to tell, and I'm not sure they would have had enough evidence to go after him. I'm not even sure if, based on all that, he would have even done the jinx, and that hot mic moment would have ever occurred in the men's room there, where they were making the film. So a lot of it was brought on by her. I'm not saying she had it coming or she should have expected it, but she knew the type of personality that he was. If she truly knew that he killed his own wife, you would have to think, with that type of intel, that if I dare dime him out, I'm next. And she took him on. I think the theory was she was going to blackmail him. In other words, you pay me and I'll keep quiet. And again, it goes back to what I said earlier. If he felt cornered and his life was in danger, that's it. There was no love lost, if you will, and he would end that relationship and the life for out of self-preservation. That's the kind of guy he was.
Right, and I would never blame a victim, but I do agree with you, if she was that close to him and if she really knew that he had killed his wife, Kathy, you would think she'd know he's a dangerous man. Let's not upset that apple cart because I wanna be safe. All right, let's turn to Morris Black. Yes, I know the jury acquitted him of murdering Morris Black because he said there was a struggle with the gun. But come on, Philip, we know he dismembered the body. I thought he took pleasures. He described how he cut up the body. It was like cutting a piece of
Mhm.
chicken to get all the body parts apart. And to me, all of that means I don't think it was an accidental shooting. He was acquitted in the eyes of the law. But what do you think about the shooting of Morris Black?
I think it was a very intelligent jury. And I remember after the trial, I believe I was in law school at the time, I was watching a debrief of some of the jurors afterwards, and a couple of them said, "Look, would I want my daughter to date him? No. Would I want to invite him home for the holidays and have dinner with us and have a table set for him there? No." But at the end of the day, they could not prove what happened in that apartment, whether or not he acted in self-defense. And I think the reason why is they never found Morris Black's head. The head was always missing, and I think to this day it was never found. And by the way, I don't know if you know this. Do you know how he got caught? How he got caught, the idiot stuffed the body parts, the dismembered body, in a hefty bag that had a piece of mail of his in it. He left a piece of mail that was addressed to him with his name and his address. Otherwise, he could have probably pulled that off, you know? It
Yeah. Yep.
so, yeah, it was crazy.
Which is kinda wild to think he has all these means at his disposal, and he chunks all the body parts in a bag with his mail that gets traced back to him. It's such a dichotomy. There's so much going on with this very, very complex man and all the things that he was involved in. But that whole Morris Black, I have to say this about public defenders, and we talk a lot about, people, how could you represent this criminal? It's constitutional rights, not only of that individual, but you and I both know of each of us because it's a slippery slope. If their constitutional rights aren't protected, guess what? Neither are ours for anything we do. And so I have the utmost respect for those like yourself who represent these individuals. Now, having said that, his defense attorney in that Morse Black, I thought did a
Oh,
phenomenal job because they had that 3D
mhm.
rendition,
Yeah,
right, of the computer animation about how the shooting occurred or could have occurred. And I felt like that was some of the best evidence, to your point, that meant you couldn't really figure out exactly what happened inside that
that's
apartment.
exactly right, and in the end, the jury believed him. Seriously, if you believe he acted in self-defense, then what he did with the body after the fact is irrelevant. I don't think he was charged with anything involving the tampering with remains and disposing of remains. I could be incorrect about that, but he beat the top charge because the jury actually believed him, and he was honest about it on the stand. They actually did a demonstration in court of how the tussle occurred between the two of them over a gun. And unfortunately, Durst was quicker on the draw and Morris Black died, but truly he felt that his life was in imminent danger and that had he not have killed him, he would have been, or Morris Black would have been the last man standing, and he wasn't going to have that. And he's entitled to that, not just under Texas law, but under natural law. Natural law says, look, we have rules of morality that govern human behavior. And one of the most sacrosanct rules of morality is to preserve your own life. And if you have to act in self defense to preserve your life, not only are you in compliance with common law, modern law, uh, and maybe even divine law, but you are in compliance with natural law.
The original sin,
Yes.
to me, he is an example of the original sin because it contradicts human nature. Robert Durst, to your point, people believed him. I think that's why he got away with everything he got away with until the age of 78. And that's when he died from natural causes. He did get COVID, according to his attorneys, and he died just shortly after he was sentenced for the murder of Susan Berman. Philip Dubé, you know I adore you. Thank you so much for coming on. Do you have any last thoughts about Robert Durst? Because, boy, we could go on and on about this character.
Just a correction about the cause of death. I don't know if you know this. It was not widely reported. And the only reason why I know it is because I happen to be personal friends with John Lewin, the prosecutor on the case. It's
I
interesting.
don't know. Tell us.
He's just a delightful human being. He truly is, and he cares about his work. The bottom line is when Robert Durst went to prison, he went there with a host of health problems and he had to undergo a minor surgery. I don't know if it was to repair a hernia, but while he was on the table during that procedure, he went into cardiac arrest. So the COVID had long passed out of his body. He was not infected with the coronavirus. He died from unrelated complications arising out of a surgical procedure that he had behind prison walls. And unfortunately, his frail body couldn't withstand the shock from the surgery, and he had a massive heart attack.
I did not know that. We knew he had lots of
Sure.
health problems during the
Yeah.
trial. Philip Dubé, now you're gonna be our guest on everything having to do with Hollywood because you know about the details. Thank you so much again for being on with
Thank
us
you.
today.
Thank you.